Ladles and jelly spoons, SimplePlanes 2 is finally released into early access, which means thousands of people like yourselves are now performing the sacred ritual of building something, flying it for approximately 8.7 seconds, realizing the laws of physics are not very nice, and planting themselves gracefully into the nearest hillside. And because for whatever reason I'm apparently trusted by adults, which I firmly believe is a systematic failure of the highest magnitude, I was allowed to make some of the stock craft featured in the game. Though to be absolutely clear, not all of them. Last thing I want to do is accidentally take credit for other people's work and start a civil war in the comments. But I did make a few of the built-in planes which you can use, abuse, paint, crash, heavily judge, turn into a pickled onion, and possibly complain about, which is absolutely fine. We're open to constructive criticism here on the Shizzle Sticks channel. Today I'm going to go through the ones I did make and talk about why they exist, what inspired them, what went wrong, and possibly why Baked Bean Bomb is a thing that now exists. Now, for those not yet blessed with the presence of SimplePlanes 2, or for whatever reason you've actually been outside touching grass, SimplePlanes 2 is the successor to SimplePlanes, a sandbox game where you build things and fail to pilot them. And Stockcraft are built-in vehicles for that game. They are probably the first things that new players will touch before disappearing back into the designer for 17 hours and coming out with either a glorious creation or a divorce settlement, possibly an obituary if you failed high school physics. But the ones I'm talking about are the KT Veleten, the Super Wasp, Wicked Wraith, Athena, Peregrine, and of course, the legendary Stormvark. We've got everything from cursed 6-engine transport plane through to a successor to the original Wasp, a production-flavoured YF-23 that flies like it's been threatened with an FAA lawsuit, and a swing-wing plane that nearly broke me emotionally. Basically a normal week for me, if we're being completely honest. First up, we have the KT Veleten. It is on screen, and as you can see or hear, you can literally hear it before you see it. This magnificent 6-engine bastard is a transport plane powered by some of the biggest radial engines you can make in the game without rummaging around in the XML like a lost pigeon in a rubbish bin. Originally it was powered by the old SimplePlanes 1 turboprops. But then I asked, what if it sounded like a herd of Lancaster bombers fell down the stairs? And now I've blessed you all with premature tinnitus. Design-wise, the KT has what they call in the business a 3-surface layout, a main wing, semi-traditional tail, and canards up front. In other words, it looks like several aircraft design departments had a disagreement. None of them actually resigned, and now you have to live with the knowledge that this is now a thing that also exists. Performance-wise, it is sluggish. It's a big transport aircraft, not a Red Bull air racist. If you try and dogfight it, that's between you and whatever deity handles bad life choices. There is, however, method to the madness. You see, big canard means big pitch authority, and in this particular instance, more lift. Which means that despite the fact that it looks like it ate 9 elephants and a titanosaur, runway length is not actually the main concern for takeoff. Wingspan, and how close your wing is to becoming an improvised chainsaw, is generally the main area of concern when introducing this flying warehouse to a runway near you. The KT Veleten has 2 cargo doors. At the front, the nose lifts up and deploys ramps because sometimes you want to load cargo like a civilized person. And at the back, there's a more traditional cargo ramp because sometimes you want to load cargo like a slightly different civilized person. And if you're feeling particularly adventurous, you can take loads from both ends at once. Inside the cargo bay, there is a magnet frame that can be lowered from the ceiling using winches and cables from the cockpit or the VTOL slider. So if you're carrying something heavy, awkward, or built by the average SimplePlanes player, which, let's be honest, means all of the above and quite possibly cursed, you can actually secure it properly instead of just hoping friction doesn't suddenly disappear and in doing so takes you out along with the rest of the plane. There's also an upper deck with the cockpit, and a couple of tables, some chairs, and a most glorious baked bean bomb. Probably the one bean that I probably wouldn't advise flicking. Now, I'm not saying this aircraft has a luxury VIP command deck. I'm saying it has somewhere for the crew to sit and reconsider every life choice that led to a 6-engine radial cargo plane with canards and a suspicious bean device. The punchline for this aircraft, though, is everyone saying, oh, it's an AN-225 after being left alone with a box of crayons. But the answer is actually, sort of, but also not really. The original inspiration, believe it or not, was not the AN225. It actually started life out as a cursed hybridization of the Peregrine P.1214 and the A400M. And then I grew the fuselage, because if SimplePlanes has taught me anything, it's people like big builds for some reason. And then it acquired 6 props, because I'm a simple man, and B36 big. But also, I'm an engineer, and realised pusher props generally don't lend themselves well to transport things, hence the tractor configuration. At some point, an AN225 inspired tail appeared because the aircraft had become so large that a single normal tail looked like it was just there for moral support. Then, after playtest review, a second deck was added, and the exterior ended up loosely taking on some design cues from the C5 Galaxy. And by the end, it had ironically become a weird looking AN225 with prop engines and cannons. At which point I decided, fine, fuck it, we just embrace it at this point. That's where the name Veleten comes from, tying it back to that big Ukrainian heavy lift energy, and the KT at the beginning is a reference to my Ukrainian friend Katie, or Kate. Next up is the Super Wasp, probably the most straightforward aircraft on this list, which is worrying because straightforward here means heavily armed carrier-capable fighter with an explicit interest in turning prehistoric marine organisms into a fine mist along with whatever entity happens to be on the receiving end of its angry missile selection. The Super Wasp is the only true successor build that I made. Essentially, we took the OG Wasp, looked at it and thought, what if Super? Essentially, and it probably goes without saying, this is the game's Super Hornet. And it was one of 2 builds I was actually pretty happy with right out the gate, which is honestly quite rare. Normally, making aircraft in these games involves building something that looks fine, flying it, realizing it handles like a shopping trolley in the middle of a tornado, and then spending hours making tiny adjustments to appease our Lord and Saviour Barnes Wallace. The Tiger Shark-inspired camo was selected by my good friend, whose name you'll never guess in a million years. He also mostly created the Starstreak missile for the aircraft and named the Starfall missile. Both of these are used on a couple of other builds. The important thing here though is that the Super Wasp is meant to feel like a dependable modern multi-role aircraft. It's not the weirdest, it's not the biggest, it's not the one with the baked bean bomb in the executive lounge. It's the aircraft you pick when you need something dependable to get shit done from the middle of the ocean. It's intended to be easy to fly for beginners, yet providing an aggressive multi-role edge for more experienced pilots. It's also probably the easiest one here to explain to people who don't really give a shit about obscure aviation history. What is it? It's a Super Hornet-ish Wasp successor. What does it do? Fighter things. Does it work? Yes. Lovely, done, no migraine required. Unfortunately, that's not something I can say about all the planes on this list, but we'll get to that one particular plane later on. The Wicked Wraith appeared in the last demo and basically is my take on a production version of the YF-23. Now the YF-23 is already one of those planes that makes aviation people behave normally, for about 4 seconds before they start licking windows and explaining why it was robbed. It's basically a glorified F5. If you want to dive into that pile of disappointment, I've linked a video here and in the description. So the job here was not to just make a copy of a prototype, it was to make something that felt more like a production-ready, game-usable version of that general idea, but also a bit angry. And that meant changes to the intakes, changes to the canopy, and the addition of forward fuselage weapons bay. And angry is the correct word because the Wraith is, without a doubt, one of the most agile stock fighter aircraft in the game, to the point where it will literally lull you into a false sense of security by making you think it has thrust vectoring. It doesn't. Which is unfortunate because you won't realise this until you're flying at about 60 knots and the control surfaces suddenly stop responding due to lack of airflow, at which point you're reminded that the aircraft control surfaces are not magic. They need air to move over them. No airflow means no authority. No authority means no dignity. And no dignity, say it with me ladles and jelly spoons, means TikTok and YouTube shorts. That's one of those things I actually really like about it though. It feels agile and advanced, but it still has a physical weakness. It doesn't just become a UFO just because somebody looked at it and saw a stealth plane and suddenly it can like fly circles in one point in space. It is, however, also exceptionally fast, like really fucking fast. Most of my builds have a max gauge to the left of the airspeed indicator, and on the big dial on this thing, It does at least a couple of loops before topping out. But the acceleration, oh, bliss! It literally just, like a Formula 1 car, but Mach plane that goes like 3 times the speed of sound or something stupid. Now, the most awkward thing about this plane wasn't actually the plane itself. It was the naming of it. It was a bit of a ball ache because I wanted to tie it back to the original YF-23 somehow, either through the sort of Black Widow 2 or the Grey Ghost, but everything I tried either sounded too generic, too edgy, or like a rejected energy drink flavour sold exclusively at petrol stations in the middle of nowhere. And then, while I was finishing the build, Crazy Licks came on with the song Wicked and solved the problem. Wicked plus ghostly YF-23 energy gives you the Wicked Wraith. And that's the Wicked Wraith, a production YF-23 flavoured exclusively air-to-air weapon of mass destruction and expert in planting you into the nearest hillside if you get too cocky at low speeds. On our list next is Athena, which is based on the OG flying Doomsday Triangle itself, the Avro Vulcan, because for whatever reason Britain looked at a Dorito and was suddenly compelled to build a nuclear deterrent around it. Athena follows that general spirit, big delta platform, bomber energy, sinister triangle vibes, and just enough stock craft nonsense sprinkled inside to remind you that this is in fact still SimplePlanes 2 and not a museum with cartoony graphics and better lighting. Payload wise, Athena is also stocked full of Boom 25s with 3 Boom 50s in there as a because of why not option. So it's not exactly a subtle aircraft. Also sounds absolutely great when it flies past. Kind of like the original Vulcan, to be honest, but doesn't quite have the howl, because that's not a thing that's modelled in SimplePlanes 2, unfortunately. I wish it was, though. I'm not entirely sure where you would start with something like that, though. But this is the sort of aircraft that you send in when the mission briefing says precision strike, but the quartermaster got a little bit too excited and has already filled the bay with suspicious explosive cylinders, left the room leaving a sticky white mess behind. It also carries 4 Starfall missiles, which definitely do not have any historic significance whatsoever. Not at all. Now, despite being a big flying triangle full of bad news, Athena actually handles deceptively well at high to medium speeds. That's where it's happiest. Get it moving, keep the air flowing, and it starts behaving like a surprisingly refined bomber rather than a cursed geometry lesson. At low speeds, obviously, you're still flying a large danger Dorito, so don't start expecting it to gently hover into your arms like a Labrador with wings. Keep the energy up, fly properly, and Athena will behave. Mostly. Athena also comes with a refueling probe for those of you feeling brave. Air-to-air refueling in the game is always funny to me because, in theory, it's a delicate, precise operation requiring training, coordination, and patience. In practice, it's 2 flying machines trying to kiss each other at 300 knots while the player develops stress-related eyesight problems after tunnel visioning on a proboscis for 45 minutes, gives up and inevitably relieves said stress by blowing up the tanker. And Athena is also currently the only one of my builds with a working radar altimeter, though that may change in future. Now, internally, Athena has one very important feature. Dave. We don't really know what Dave does or why a Dave is here. You're probably thinking, what is a Dave? And that is exactly the kind of dangerous question that gets engineers transferred to departments with no windows and or a mental asylum. Athena also has a center console that retracts when you open the canopy. Yes, the center console retracts, and I'm saying that twice because I guarantee only about 3 of you noticed it, and the rest of you are going back to the beginning of the section to make sure I'm not lying. And yes, before the Vulcan people start foaming gently into their Haynes manuals, I'm aware of the original Vulcan was primarily entered and exited through the hatch near the nose gear. I know, but I'm also lazy, and the working bay doors are not really a thing just yet, so you're getting a canopy entrance and you're going to enjoy it. Also, if it helps you sleep at night, the Vulcan did actually have an openable canopy of its own, so please place your valued angry comments gently into Dave and leave. So that's Athena. A Vulcan-inspired flying triangle full of bombs, suspicious missiles, a refueling probe for masochists, a working radar altimeter, a retracting center console, and, of course, Dave. The aircraft handles better than it has any right to, carries enough explosive persuasion to make a map nervous, and contains at least one structural Keter-class mystery powerful enough to delete an engineer. which to be honest is exactly what I want from a stock bomber. And then we have the Peregrine, and this one needs a little bit of explaining because it's one of those aircraft where the fake one actually is more real than people give it credit for. A lot of people look at the KT Veleten and assume it's based off an AN225 because it's a massive 6-engine cargo plane, and then they look at the Peregrine and go, ah yes, total fantasy aircraft, which is funny because it's almost completely fucking backwards. For those of you unfamiliar, I'm an aviation nerd, which means every so often I go digging through old design studies and technical papers looking for whatever aerospace abomination next crawls out of history's filing cabinet, and the BAe P.1214 absolutely did that. This was one of those British, what if Harrier, but somehow more unhinged concepts. A forward-swept, supersonic-ish VTOL fighter study from an era where British aerospace engineers were apparently given graph paper, possibly a cabinet full of hallucinogenic drugs, and no adult supervision. The P1214 and later the P1216 family were part of the same broad Kingston design lineage that explored advanced Harrier successor A. Stovall's ideas, including twin boom layouts and 3-bearing swivel nozzle concepts rather than the Harrier's 4-nozzle arrangement. And the P1214 didn't just catch my eye, and you could tell this because it basically spawned an entire fucking video, which I will also place somewhere around here and in the description. Because look at it, it's forward swept, it's VTOL, it had weird nozzle, it has cancelled British fighter project energy radiating off it like a damp shed full of classified regret. So the Peregrine is not me waking up one morning and going, what if I made a fake VTOL vertigo plane, but with backwards wings? It's very heavily inspired by our actual real aircraft design. The biggest creative liberty here is that SimplePlanes doesn't currently have a proper 3-bearing swivel nozzle, so I had to admit defeat and give it a more conventional VTOL nozzle instead. This is what we call in engineering a compromise, or in my case, swearing at the designer until it flies. Now, when the Peregrine was first introduced, a lot of people thought it was meant to be a successor to the Vertigo, and I understand why. It's a VTOL, it's weird, it looks like it might have been designed after someone left the Vertigo too close to Chernobyl nuclear power plant, and to be fair, in some respects, it almost was. Not because that was the grand plan, but because the actual Vertigo 4 wasn't finished yet, and for at least at the time, we didn't know if it would be finished at all. So the Peregrine ended up in this awkward position where some people looked at it and thought, hang on, is this a forward-swept imposter replacing the Vertigo? Which led to a bit of understandable disappointment, because you're expecting the next Vertigo and instead you get a British P1214 inspired VTOL gremlin with forward-swept wings. But the irony is the actual P1214 was itself chasing the idea of a Harrier successor, but so in the weirdest way possible, the Peregrine being mistaken for a Vertigo successor aircraft is historically on brand. Now, because VTOL aircraft are twitchy little bastards, the Peregrine needed a decent stabilization system. So I nicked the stabilization system from the Vertigo 4, but you didn't hear that from me. And once it's in forward flight, the Peregrine fills that similar broad role to the Super Wasp, but with a much bigger emphasis on tank busting and generally looking like it's something a normal person would ask security to remove from the building. Despite being fairly small for a fighter, the Peregrine carries, quite frankly, a rude amount of weaponry. You get air-to-air and air-to-ground options, laser-guided missiles, rockets, heat seekers, the Starstreak missile mentioned earlier, all the usual tools for converting someone else's machinery into a strongly worded insurance claim. And then, because apparently I lack any form of restraint, it has 2 miniguns. 2. This is technically historically accurate on the design. On a small VTOL fighter, that is also a switch to enable crude 2D thrust vectoring, which does make it slightly overpowered in dogfighting, because if you manage to point the nose at something, the Peregrine doesn't so much as shoot it as file it down into improvised chaff. So yes, it can do air-to-air, it can do air-to-ground, it can hover, it can tank bust, it can dogfight, it can probably do your taxes. It can look deeply strange while doing all of the above. In case you didn't notice, despite its size, this is not exactly a subtle plane. Now, the Peregrine also has a slightly painful public debut because this aircraft had a bunch of fun improvements lined up for the last demo, and then an hour before the submission deadline, my computer crashed, which is always lovely. There are a few sounds more seriously destructive than a PC dying right before a deadline, so those changes didn't make it in, which meant that I then had to sit there and watch 1-star craft reviews roll in. Now, did I throw a strop? No, absolutely not. I definitely behaved like a mature adult. Anyway, after completely mature non-strop, I went away and made further improvements to the Peregrine. And thankfully, people seemed to enjoy the improved version quite a bit more, so it all worked out in the end, which is nice because the Peregrine is one of those aircraft that could really have been misunderstood forever if first impressions had stuck. And that's the Peregrine, a beautiful little goblin, just don't feed it after midnight. And last, but by no means least, we have my pride and joy, the Stormvark. Now this one's quite special to me, not because the F111B is the best plane in the world, I mean it is, there's no argument about that, but because the original version of this essentially opened the floodgates for community-made stock crafts. During the playtest, I was working on an F111B build because we all have at least one unhealthy obsession, and Kevin, one of the developers, flew it, liked how it looked and handled, and asked if I'd be open to making it a stock craft if we were allowed, and I said yes, because apparently I enjoy assigning myself burnout and copious amounts of stress. And that's how the F111B helped open the floodgates for playtester builds being used as stock crafts. Which, if I do say so myself, is a pretty neat piece of lore for the plane. Also absolutely fucking terrifying because now your weird little project has become part of the game and suddenly you're partially responsible for other people's first impressions. No pressure there. Just the entire player base potentially judging your aeroplane while you stare off into the middle distance like a Victorian orphan wondering what life choices led to this moment. Now, coincidentally, like the F111B, the Stormvark also had a very troubled development and was almost pulled altogether from the stockcraft roster after some wing physics changes right before the first demo rendered it basically unflyable. And when I say unflyable, I don't mean suboptimal. I mean, if you pull any amount of AOA, you will, 100% guaranteed, find yourself in pieces in a local field near you, after aspiring to be ground cluttered the moment your wheels are 5 inches off the runway. The issue was eventually resolved in time for the demo, but not without cost. I'm talking handling so bad a brick could outturn it. A battered reputation that lives on to this day in my own fucking comment section. And it actually caused me to develop a migraine powerful enough to qualify as an electronic warfare. I was knocked out for about 8 fucking hours with the bloody thing. Also, Dorian decided it was a great idea to highlight just how shit its turn radius is by mentioning it in one of the posts. So it was the reputation was kind of locked in from that point onwards, which, to be fair, not their fault, it's not anyone's fault, it's just an unfortunate set of circumstances. Now, later updates let me bring the Stormvark back closer to its original former glory, but the reputational damage had already been done. People remembered the bad version, which for all it's quite annoying is hilariously on brand for the F111B to be judged on a prototype. Coincidentally, I also have a video on that. I might as well just link the entire fucking Distilled Danger Zone playlist right here, and in the description. This whole video is basically just one shameless self-advertisement for my channel, to be honest. The latest iteration of the Stormvark also features a radar in the nose, and not just a pretend sticker that looks like an afterthought. No, it was almost though, but only because Dot saved me from that tragic mistake. But rather it now has a physical moving radar that you can actually see by flicking the respective nose stow switch in the cockpit. As far as I'm aware, that makes it the only stock craft with a physical moving radar, which is a sort of detail I love in SimplePlanes because it's completely unnecessary right up until the point you finally notice it and suddenly it becomes the most important thing in the universe. The Stormvark also packs one hell of a punch, with 14 hardpoints. Any normal person would look at this plane and think it was overcompensating for something. And you'd be right. In traditional F111B style, it doesn't have a gun for air-to-air use, though it does have 2 gun pods for air-to-ground use. Sadly, though, the rate of fire is too small for them to emulate the success of the Peregrine. It does, however, make it very overpowered for the mech invasion mission for some reason. Mechs can tank boom 50s and laser guided munitions and missiles the size of small buildings, but not guns for some reason, which feels like an alternate version of War of the Worlds, except the common cold is replaced by a pair of 30mm pea shooters. The rest of the loadout is also pretty impressive too. In traditional F111B style, it carries a couple of AIM-54 inspired Anzu missiles, a pair of AIM-9 inspired Viper missiles, and some random Turbo Rider missiles. I'm not really sure why I named them what I did, and they're not really based off anything in particular. I just kind of made them while listening to Reckless Love's Turbo Rider and thought they looked pretty cool. The internal weapons bay also houses 3 laser-guided bombs for the giggles, and for when you need some more traditional vintage F111 tank busting. So the Stormvark is the cursed swing wing child. It started with the F111B playtest build, accidentally helped kick down the door for playtest of stock aircraft, nearly got murdered by wing physics, ruined my head, but I survived, and now it has a physical moving radar to give Chad migraines instead. Needless to say, this is my favourite personal build. I also resent it ever so slightly for the pain it costs, but it wouldn't be family if it wasn't a bit of an arsehole every once in a while. So, those are the stock craft I made, and by making stock craft, and making stock craft is weird because they're not just personal builds anymore, they become part of how people meet the game. There are little introductions to what the builder can do. Here's a bomber, here's a fighter, here's a VTOL, here's cargo aircraft, here's swing wing thing, here's Dave, don't ask about Dave. And then within about 10 minutes somebody will take one of them apart, put engines on backwards, strap the cockpit to a fridge and discover a new form of flight that makes the Wright brothers look like cowards. Which is, it's perfect, to be completely honest, because that is exactly what SimplePlanes is for. It's not just about making aircraft that work, it's about making aircraft that nearly work, finding out why they don't, swearing at the designer for 2 hours, moving one control surface 3 pixels to the left, and suddenly becoming emotionally attached to a flying war crime. So if you've flown any of these already, let me know which ones you liked, which one you immediately crashed, and which one you think handles like it was tuned in a shed during a carbon monoxide leak. And if you haven't tried SimplePlanes 2 yet, it's in early access right now. Go build something beautiful. Or terrible. Ideally both. And on that note, ladles and jelly spoons, thank you for watching this video. Fuck, what's my outro again? Oh yeah, goodbye and thanks for watching. I can't believe I forgot my outro. Jesus.